Armed black man has cast a spotlight once again on police brutality. Local researcher believes that there's striking similarities between policing in the US and in South Africa. Joining us for this conversation tonight, Khadija Bawa of the Social Justice Coalition. Khadija, good evening, and thank you so much for your time on News at Prime tonight. It's interesting because when the analysis of what is happening in America and the outrage that we are seeing and experiencing by South Africans who are expressing it on social media platforms in different ways, when that started happening, some people, of course, started to call it out and say, actually, there's a level of hypocrisy to this conversation because there have been South Africans who have died at the hands of police, and it hasn't been met with the same level of public outrage.
So I think, so I did see those concerns and those outrage, but I think there's a complexity to this. Thank you, firstly, sorry for having me, but there's a complexity to the NGO sector, the civil society sector, and poor black South Africans that have been protesting for the last 20 odd years, since the induction of our democracy, have been met with police brutality, have called out that police brutality and confronted it head-on through advocacy, campaigning, and a number of other methods, versus certain individuals who might not have seen it in their social media trends or tweets, and then to draw the correlation that South Africans don't care about police brutality that's happening at home. The two incidences in the wake of our democracy that counter-narratives this is one, feet must fall, but also the massacre at Marikana. There were massive protests at the end of both of those series of incidences where many South Africans took to the street and called out police brutality. And that was on a national level. And on a local level, in every single province, there are NGOs, organizations, and communities that have actively and consistently worked to call out police brutality. So while I understand people wanting to draw the correlation to South Africa, I think it's a bit disingenuous to say that South Africans haven't been contesting police brutality at home.
Sure. One of the issues that is being looked at as part of this conversation is you look at the Black Lives Movement and campaign that has its origins in the US, and you look at the work that civil society has been doing in South Africa. A comparison has been made even between the kind of budgets that these organizations are working within. Is that a big factor in how NGOs are able to organize society, organize around issues to the point where they end up on the streets for a consecutive number of days behind one cause?
So I'm sure that as a researcher working at an NGO as well, that budget considerations will always be considered. But I think that what's happening in the US now is the result of almost centuries of police and security force violence against black men and women in the United States. So it's almost in comparison to compare that to South Africa, because at the end of apartheid in South Africa, there really was a belief that policing in South Africa would protect and serve especially the poor and especially the vulnerable in South Africa. So the two narratives, while they stem from a similar history, there are hundreds of years and decades that separate the two of them.
Sure. The one thing that seems to run between both, of course, are structural inefficiencies and racism that has been inculcated within the system.
Definitely. So we see this with South Africa as well, right? So what's interesting, or the difference about the United States and South Africa, is that when we talk about security services in South Africa, it's almost majority black police officers. But the institutions, these institutions, whether it's the South African National Defence Force, the South African Police Service, and local law enforcement, they still embody these very racist tropes, right? So we saw during lockdown who was policed, who was brutalized, and who was not, right? And so when we're talking about the institutional culture of both the US and South Africa, we do see white supremacy and hypermasculinity as a similarity in both.
And speak to me about how you see traces of this in the practical incidents where there has been police brutality meted out against civilians of this country.
I mean, in the last 26 years, the history of protest in South Africa is testament to that, right? When we all took to the streets last year for anti-gender-based violence protests, you saw that there were certain groups of people that weren't getting brutalized, and you saw other groups of people in different locations asking for the exact same thing, that were being meted out with water cannons and stun grenades. But we really do see police forces in South Africa, especially in protests, being used as a vehicle for violence. When we're talking about violent protests in South Africa, we're talking about state services and state forces that initiate violence through the apparatuses of the state.
And of course, the argument that police always use to counter is that they're often dealing with unruly mobs that they are unable to control. And it comes down to the language often, and how important is how we describe protests and people's expression of trying to have their grievances dealt with. How important is how we frame it to the result of the actual protest. So what are we sparking when we frame it as angry mobs, as, you know, I think the US president has used terms like looters, alluded to some of the protesters being terrorists even.
Yes. I think those narratives are extremely damaging, and not only are they damaging, they are severely inaccurate, right? So whether we're looking at the United States or we're looking at protesting in South Africa, there is a number of things, especially from in the NGO sector, but also from local communities. There are a number of things, years of advocacy and mobilization, where the residences of poor communities, women in South Africa, unions in South Africa are asking for a list of grievances to be addressed, to be acknowledged, to be dealt with. And it is only when it reaches a certain stage that we see protesting in the street. And so when we do see those protests, it's often with a narrative that vilifies protesters. So I do think, rightly pointed out, that this narrative is extremely important. And it's so damaging to vilify people that are asking for basic services or basic safety and security, and describing them as unruly. These people have thought, they have researched, they have grievances, they have legitimate grievances. And it's important that we acknowledge that, and we not just talk about, you know, like, the unruliness of it all.
Sure. In moments such as this, leadership becomes crucial, and certainly one would want a government that shows empathy. I'm seeing tonight that one of the parties, the local parties, ATM, is calling on President Cyril Ramaphosa to go and visit the family of Collins Khosa, to go and offer a personal word of courage to them as they grieve the loss of this father and husband. How important is empathy during this period?
I think empathy is extremely important, but we cannot just have empathy for the sake of photo ops, right?
Yeah.
We can't have empathy as a, you know, a plaster to a bullet wound. We also need accountability. So what is also important is that the Minister of Defense and Policing and those who are in charge of local law enforcement at the metro level, they need to be held accountable for the narrative that local, national and the defense force are pushing when it comes to policing South African citizens. Empathy is extremely important, but what we are sitting in a crisis of is accountability. You'll see that in the judgments and the statements after the murder of Collins Khosa, you'll see that even Becky Cele was hesitant to acknowledge that there was a wrong that was committed. And that's completely unacceptable. It's abhorrent. And that is something that we have to address.
All right. Khadija Bawa, let me thank you for your time tonight. She's with the Social Justice Coalition. After the break, we'll take you